When you start looking into immigration in the U.S. these days, it feels like stepping right into a tangle of really strong opinions, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. And just tons of information, often pointing in completely different directions.
Yeah, it's confusing. Emotions run super high,
Yeah.
and just figuring out the basic facts can feel like a huge job.
Well, that's exactly what we're trying to tackle in this deep dive. We're not aiming to solve the whole giant debate, obviously.
Yeah.
But we are going to zero in on one specific recent case that honestly shines a light on so many of these issues. It's the deportation of Kilmar Abrego Garcia.
Abrego Garcia, okay.
Yeah, his situation kind of brings together a lot of the legal knots, the political fights, and, the social tensions that are really driving the whole immigration conversation right now.
Okay, so this case is like a lens then. Our goal here is to use it to get a better handle on the key arguments, the controversies around immigration reform, sanctuary cities, that kind of thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to do that, we've gathered insights from a pretty wide range of sources. We've got articles from places like the Heritage Foundation, the Hoover Institution, Breitbart.
Okay, so some definite conservative viewpoints there.
Definitely.
Yeah.
But also the Chicago Council on Global Affairs for polling data, a pretty interesting Reddit discussion we found.
Oh, Reddit. That could be varied.
Oh, it is. And even a transcript from the Clay Travis and Buck Sexton show. So a real mix.
Right. So the mission is basically to sift through all this, pull out the really important bits from each perspective.
And try to give everyone listening a clearer picture of the different arguments and, what's really at stake here.
Okay, sounds good. Let's dive in. Kilmar Abrego Garcia, who is he, and what's the basic timeline we're working with?
Okay, so Kilmar Abrego Garcia, he's originally from El Salvador. He first came to the U.S. when he was a teenager.
Right.
And his reason, he stated, was to flee gang violence that was targeting his family back home.
Okay, fleeing violence, that's a common narrative.
It is. Now, here's a really crucial point. Back in 2019, an immigration court granted him something called withholding of removal.
Withholding of removal, what does that mean exactly? Was it like asylum?
It's similar, but it's legally distinct. Basically, the judge believed his testimony, believed he had a credible fear of persecution if he went back to El Salvador, specifically from a gang called Barrio 18, which is actually a rival to MS-13.
Ah, okay. So the judge found his fear credible.
Yes. And that ruling meant he had legal protection against being deported to El Salvador because of that specific danger. And importantly, it also came with a work permit here in the U.S.
So he had this legal status, this protection. What happened in March 2025 then?
Well, in March of this year, ICE Immigration and Customs Enforcement arrested him.
Arrested him. Okay.
And then, despite that court order, the one granting him withholding of removal, they deported him back to El Salvador.
Wait, they deported him even with that court order saying he shouldn't be sent back there?
Exactly. That's a huge part of the controversy.
So what was the justification? Why arrest and deport him if that ruling was in place?
Well, the administration's claim at the time of the arrest was that he was affiliated with MS-13.
Ah, the rival gang, not the one he was supposedly fleeing from.
Correct. They based this claim on reports of him being seen in the company of other ranking gang members and also information from what they called a reliable source.
Okay, reliable source. That sounds potentially vague. And this deportation, it didn't just happen quietly, did it? There were legal challenges.
Oh, absolutely not quite. Legal challenges were filed almost immediately. Courts actually issued orders telling the government to facilitate his return to the U.S.
Facilitate his return, so bring him back.
Essentially, yes. But then you have another complication. The president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, came out and publicly stated that Abrego Garcia would stay in custody in El Salvador.
So El Salvador is refusing to release him, even if U.S. courts are saying he should come back.
That seems to be the situation. And there are even reports suggesting the U.S. government is actually paying El Salvador to keep him detained there.
Paying El Salvador to detain someone we might have improperly deported.
That's what's being reported. It really shows how complicated these things get, crossing international borders and involving different governments' decisions.
Wow. Okay, let's dig into that MS-13 affiliation claim, because that seems central to the deportation justification. What actual evidence was presented?
Right. Let's go back to 2019 again, during an earlier bond hearing. This is before the withholding of removal was granted, when they were deciding if he should be detained initially.
Okay.
The evidence cited then to deny him bond included a few things. There's a GFIS, a gang field interview sheet.
Like a police form?
Yeah, where officers note suspected gang contacts. There was also an I-213 form that's a basic immigration record of a deportable alien. Plus, the fact he'd been arrested with people alleged to be gang members. And then there was this claim from a confidential informant.
The reliable source.
Possibly the same one, or related. This informant claimed Abrego Garcia was part of an MS-13 clique in New York.
In New York? But didn't you say he'd never lived there?
That's what's reported, yes. He apparently has never lived in New York.
Okay, so an informant claiming he's in a gang in a place he's never been, that sounds problematic.
It definitely raised eyebrows, and concerns about that informant's reliability were brought up. It even came out later that the police officer involved with that informant was suspended for misconduct, though in a separate case. Still, it doesn't exactly boost confidence.
No, it doesn't. Did the Supreme Court weigh in on this evidence at all?
Interestingly, yes. In a related but separate case concerning his detention, the Supreme Court, in a unanimous 9-0 opinion, actually commented on how weak that initial evidence seemed.
9-0. Wow. Okay, so weak initial evidence noted by the Supreme Court. Has he ever actually been charged criminally with anything gang-related?
No. That's another key point. Despite these allegations flying around in the immigration context, there's no record of him ever facing criminal charges for gang membership, let alone being convicted.
So how could an immigration judge in 2019 say, evidence shows he is a verified member of MS-13, as one source mentioned?
Right. That quote came from a bond hearing. And it's really, really important to understand the difference in standards here.
Okay.
In a criminal trial, you need proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Very high standard. In an immigration bond hearing, the government often just needs to show probable cause or argue someone's a danger or flight risk. It's a much, much lower bar.
Okay. So verified member in that context doesn't mean the same as a criminal conviction.
Not at all. Critics really jumped on this. They described the so-called evidence as basically amounting to him wearing a Chicago Bulls hat and hoodie.
A Bulls hat?
Yeah. And this, quote, vague, uncorroborated allegation from a confidential informant claiming he belonged to MS-13's Western clique in New York, a place he has never lived.
So the critics are saying that evidence was incredibly flimsy.
That's their argument, yes.
Yeah.
Very thin and circumstantial, especially the New York connection.
Okay, so we have a deportation that happened despite a court order preventing it, based on gang allegations supported by seemingly questionable evidence. This screams due process issues.
Absolutely. That's the core legal argument against the deportation.
Yeah.
It's framed as a violation of his due process rights and a direct disregard for that valid court order, the withholding of removal.
The fact that he was deported while a legal stay was technically in place, that seems like a pretty big deal procedurally.
It is. It raises serious questions about whether the government followed its own rules and the legal processes that are supposed to be in place.
Right. It kind of feeds into this narrative you sometimes hear about the system maybe not always sticking to its own safeguards.
Exactly. And proponents of due process argue, look, these rights apply to everyone in the U.S. legal system. It doesn't matter what someone is accused of, whether it's gang ties or anything else, or what their immigration status is. The process itself has to be followed.
Yeah.
We saw that sentiment reflected, maybe informally, on that Reddit thread. Someone characterized the government's actions as basically, oops, lol, we messed up and we don't care to make it right.
Well, yeah. While informal, that definitely captures a certain frustration about the procedural side of things.
It does. It reflects that feeling that the rules weren't followed and maybe there wasn't enough effort to correct it.
Now, there was another element mentioned in some sources, allegations of domestic violence. How does that fit in?
Yes, that came up. Reports showed his wife filed for a restraining order against him back in 2021.
Okay. What did the filing allege?
It cited physical abuse,
Yeah.
Things like punching, scratching, ripped clothes, bruises, serious allegations.
Definitely serious. What happened with that restraining order? Was it granted? Did it stick?
Well, this is where it gets a bit more complicated. She actually didn't pursue the order in the end.
Oh, she dropped it.
Essentially, yes. She later gave a statement saying they'd worked through their problems, gone to counseling, and that their marriage was actually stronger now. She specifically denied any ongoing violence.
I see. So an allegation was made, but then withdrawn with claims of reconciliation. How is this being used in the debate around his deportation?
It's being used differently by different sides, as you might expect.
Right.
Some people point to the initial allegations as a reason why he shouldn't be allowed back in the U.S., arguing it shows bad character or potential danger.
Kind of a character argument.
Exactly. But others argue that, look, whatever happened or didn't happen in their marriage, it's a separate issue from the legal question of due process and whether the deportation itself was lawful.
They're saying it's irrelevant to the legal procedure question.
Precisely. They argue focusing on the domestic violence claims is a way to distract from the government's actions and the violation of the court order.
Okay, so two distinct issues. The legality of the deportation versus his personal history. Let's shift gears a bit now and look at the broader views on immigration reform reflected in our sources. The Heritage Foundation piece, what was their main take?
The Heritage Foundation piece really anchors its arguments in the principles of rule of law and fairness.
Okay.
They're quite critical of past policies, specifically pointing fingers at what they call President Obama's executive amnesty policies. They argue those fail to properly enforce existing immigration laws.
So for them, enforcement is paramount.
Yes. Their core belief is that you need to demonstrate strong enforcement first before you can even talk about other reforms.
And what does strong enforcement look like to them? What specific things do they want to see happen?
Well, top of the list is securing the border. They talk about physical barriers, but also a virtual fence using more technology like surveillance, drones, sensors.
Okay, border security first. What else?
They stress rigorously enforcing the laws already on the books. Don't ignore them. They also want to empower state and local governments to get more involved in immigration enforcement.
Oh.
They specifically mention programs like 287G. That's where local police can be trained and authorized to act, essentially, as immigration agents under federal supervision.
Okay, so getting local law enforcement involved. Anything beyond domestic enforcement?
Yes. They also talk about the international angle. They think the U.S. should lead efforts, especially in Central America, to tackle the root causes, crime, violence, poverty, that push people to migrate in the first place.
Address the push factors.
Exactly. They even mention Plan Colombia as a possible model to look at for that kind of long-term engagement. And finally, they emphasize using honest, clear statistics to track how well enforcement is actually working. Transparency, accountability.
So Heritage says, prove you're serious about enforcement. First, secure the border, enforce existing laws, empower locals, address root causes. Only then can you talk about legislative reform.
That's the sequence they advocate for, yes. And when they do talk about eventual legislative reform, what do they envision?
What kind of reforms?
Things like further strengthening border security, continuing to empower states, supporting security and economic freedom abroad, and reforming the legal immigration system.
How would they reform legal immigration?
Now, their focus seems to be on prioritizing high-skilled workers and creating genuinely temporary worker programs for specific labor needs, more of an economic focus for legal pathways.
Okay, that gives us a clear view from Heritage. Now, what about broader Republican sentiment? That Chicago Council on Global Affairs poll data you mentioned, what did that show?
Yeah, the 2024 survey showed some really stark numbers. Concern among Republicans about large numbers of immigrants and refugees coming in. It's at a record high.
Record high concern.
Yes. Over 80% now see it as a critical threat to the country. That's a huge number. And it really highlights a growing divide between Republicans and the general American public on this.
A widening gap. How does that concern translate to views about immigrants' impact?
Well, the poll found about 60% of Republicans believe immigrants have a mainly negative impact on American society.
Negative impact. How does that compare?
It's quite different from Democrats and independents, and the majority of Americans overall tend to see the impact as mostly positive or neutral. So, again, a significant partisan split there.
And what about policy preferences, specifically regarding undocumented immigrants already here?
This was also striking. A majority of Republicans actually support mass detention, putting undocumented immigrants in camps while they wait for hearings.
Mass detention, is that widely supported?
No, it's opposed by a majority of Americans overall. The poll also found a plurality of Republicans think undocumented immigrants who are working here should just be required to leave.
Required to leave, rather than finding a path to stay legally.
Right. Preference for removal. And about half of Republicans favored decreasing legal immigration levels, too.
Okay. And given the focus on the border, what about using the military?
Overwhelming support among Republicans for that. Over 80% favor using the U.S. military to stop immigrants at the border.
80%. That's very high. It shows a real intensity of feeling about border control.
It certainly does.
Yeah.
Strong preference for very robust, even militarized enforcement measures.
Okay, so a clear picture of heightened concern and a desire for stricter measures among Republicans from that poll. Let's pivot now to sanctuary cities. The Hoover Institution piece offered a different angle, maybe a more nuanced conservative take.
It did, yeah. It was interesting. It starts by defining sanctuary cities clearly basically, places that limit how much they cooperate with federal immigration enforcement. Specifically, they often refuse to hold people in local jail just because ICE asks them to, if there's no other legal reason to hold them.
Right, the ICE detainers issue. And what's the legal basis for this? Are they just breaking federal law?
That's the common charge, but the Hoover piece argues no. It points to a legal principle called the anti-commandeering doctrine.
Anti-commandeering.
Yeah, it basically says the federal government can't force state or local governments to use their own resources and personnel to enforce federal laws. They can't just deputize the local police as ICE agents against their will.
So sanctuary cities are using that legal discretion.
Exactly. They're not necessarily defying federal law. They're exercising their lawful choice about how to deploy their own police and resources. They're prioritizing local law enforcement needs.
That's a key distinction. But from a conservative viewpoint that usually emphasizes federal law, isn't opposing sanctuary cities the natural fit?
Well, this is where the Hoover piece gets thought-provoking. It suggests that fighting against sanctuary cities might actually clash with other conservative values.
Like what?
Like local autonomy, states' rights, limited federal interference in local affairs. The article even draws a parallel to Second Amendment sanctuaries.
Where localities declare they won't enforce certain federal gun laws?
Right. So the piece kind of asks, if you support local resistance to federal power on guns, is it consistent to oppose it on immigration? It highlights a potential tension within conservative thought.
Interesting point. What other arguments did the Hoover piece explore?
It laid out the usual arguments on both sides. Critics worry sanctuary policies harbor criminals and weaken federal immigration control.
Okay.
Defenders argue they protect families, uphold local control, and can actually improve public safety.
Improve safety. How does that work? That seems counterintuitive.
The argument is, if immigrants, documented or undocumented, are afraid that any contact with local police could lead to deportation, they won't report crimes. They won't come forward as witnesses.
I see. Fear silences them.
Exactly. Which could make entire communities less safe because crimes go unreported and unsolved. So defenders say sanctuary policies build trust, making people more willing to cooperate with local police on local crimes, which benefits everyone.
So it's a more complex calculation. Less cooperation with ICE might actually mean more cooperation with local police on other issues.
That's the argument. It suggests anti-sanctuary policies could have unintended negative consequences for local crime fighting.
Okay, that adds another layer. Now let's bring it back to the Abrego-Garcia case specifically. How did the Republican-leaning media sources like Breitbart and the Clay Travis and Buck Sexton show cover this?
Their framing was pretty consistent. They tended to portray anyone expressing concern about his deportation, especially Democrats, as, quote, coming to the rescue of an illegal alien.
Okay, framing it as defending someone who shouldn't be here.
Yes. There was constant emphasis on labeling him an illegal immigrant and repeating the claim that he's a verified member of MS-13, often stated as undisputed fact, despite the evidence questions we discussed.
Right, downplaying the doubts about the evidence.
Or ignoring them entirely.
Yeah.
Their overall stance was strong support for his deportation.
Seeing it as necessary enforcement.
Yes. Removing someone they view as undesirable and potentially dangerous due to the gang allegation. They were generally critical, sometimes mocking, of any calls to review the case or check on his welfare in El Salvador, dismissing those as just welfare checks.
And did they connect it to broader immigration policy?
Yeah, they often used it as an opportunity to praise stricter enforcement policies, sometimes contrasting current border situations with, say, lower encounter numbers during the Trump administration, arguing for a return to tougher approaches.
Got it. So a very clear narrative focused on enforcement and portraying him negatively. Finally, let's talk about that Reddit discussion. What did that add to the mix? It sounds like it was all over the place.
It really was. It perfectly illustrated just how polarized this is. You had a huge range of takes, making it super hard to find any kind of consensus or even a balanced middle ground.
Was there a dominant theme, though?
If there was one, it was probably skepticism. Skepticism towards official stories from any side. A lot of distrust in the information being presented by the government or even mainstream media.
Interesting. What specific points kept coming up in the discussion?
Well, many people were focused on what they saw as the lack of solid proof for the MS-13 link.
The evidence issue again.
Right. And the procedural problems deporting him despite a court order. That bothered a lot of people online. There was also, predictably, debate about the domestic violence allegations.
How so? Same split as we discussed.
Pretty much.
Mm.
Some felt it was crucial context about his character. Others thought it was irrelevant to the legal process of the deportation itself and possibly a distraction.
And any broader takeaways from the Reddit chatter?
Yeah, there were definitely recurring worries about government overreach, about due process being ignored, and quite a few comments urged people to try and find primary sources, look at international news, basically try to get information that wasn't filtered through a strong domestic political lens.
People trying to find less biased info on their own.
Exactly. It highlighted that struggle many people feel in navigating these really charged, complex stories where reliable facts seem hard to come by.
So it really does seem like this one case, Kilmar Abrego Garcia, touches almost every hot-button issue in the U.S. immigration debate today.
It really does. You've got the contested facts around gang affiliation, the fundamental legal questions about due process and following court orders,
Right.
the different conservative ideas about how reform should happen versus just enforcement, the whole sanctuary city debate and federalism.
And layered over all of it, this intense political polarization we see in the media coverage and online discussions.
It's all there. It really is a microcosm of the larger battles being fought over immigration policy.
A single story reflecting these huge ongoing national arguments.
Exactly. It reminds us just how fundamental and how conflicting the principles at stake really are.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, it leaves us, and hopefully our listeners, with a lot to think about. When you consider everything, national security, due process, states' rights, humanitarian concerns, what principle should be paramount in guiding U.S. immigration policy? It's a tough question, isn't it?
It is. And maybe the even tougher question is, how do you balance them? These principles often seem to pull in opposite directions. Finding that balance, one that reflects both our laws and maybe our deeper values, is the ongoing challenge.
It certainly is. Hopefully exploring this case has given everyone a better framework for thinking about those challenges.
Yeah, we hope this provided a solid foundation. But like we said, it's complex. There are always more layers, more perspectives. The learning definitely doesn't stop here. We encourage everyone to keep digging, keep questioning, and keep thinking critically about this vital issue.